All right, everybody, thank you so much for joining me in this first webinar of the Rumble Spatial Data Science webinar series. My name is Ian Breckheimer. I'm a staff research scientist at Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory. And this is my chance to give you guys a sense of what's currently possible with spatial data, particularly some of the tools and data sets that are available for researchers who are not from a traditional remote sensing background. My target audience here are field scientists, people who take measurements, usually using their own eyeballs or in-field equipment. And the real goal here is to build an awareness and build skill sets that are going to allow you to take advantage of remote measurements from satellites, from airplanes, from ground-based sensors, in addition to all of the things that we already know how to do. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll get started. I just want to emphasize this is the first session in 6 webinars that are planned for the winter and early spring of I guess winter of 2020, early spring of 2021. And so this is the first one, Introduction to the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab Spatial Data Platform. This is going to serve both as an introduction to some of the work that we're specifically doing at Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, and also a more general introduction to the broader suite of data sets available and tools available in this world. So without further ado, I will get to the outline of my talk. So it's essentially going to ask a couple of different questions. The first one is why? And that's, why is this a good time for field researchers to build their spatial data science skills? And there are a couple of different reasons for that I'm going to go into. Finally, next there's what. What foundational concepts do I need to know to use spatial data effectively? So it's not actually that hard. Geography is a big and very old field, but there are really just 4 key concepts that you guys need to understand to start to use spatial data in your research and match up these new remote sensing measurements to field data in an effective and sensible way. I'm going to talk a little bit about what data is out there that might be useful in your work. We're going to talk about data sets that are available both at a continental scale, global scale, and also more locally around Western Colorado, which is where my home institution is. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do this. Like, how do we build the skills necessary to make progress matching up field data to remote sensing? And this is mostly going to be an interactive session. So I've got some slides that are going to take, I think, around 40 to 60 minutes to go through. And then after that, I'm going to work through some interactive sessions. I'm going to demo a few standard workflows that I find very helpful in my work, and hopefully you guys will as well. I would just say that if you want to follow along, in the email introduction that I sent a few days ago, there was a link to a GitHub repository. That GitHub repository has code, it has slides, it's going to have a link to the recording, it's going to have lecture notes as soon as I finish those up. This is going to be a good place to kind of ground your participation in the webinar, and also follow up on some of that skill development. So I will say that if you want to follow along, what you want to do is go ahead and if you have previously downloaded those materials, please download them again or clone them again. And that's because there have been a few updates in the last few hours as I found bugs and squashed hopefully most of them. Anyway, so that's what we're up to. I just wanted to start by talking a little bit about my own particular journey. I was actually born in Western North Carolina, and I went to undergrad at a small college there. I did a master's in geography at Chapel Hill. It was really where I started to get exposed to remote sensing. And then I did a biology PhD at the University of Washington, where I was really focused on understanding plant responses to climate change. I did a short stint at Harvard University as a postdoc, and then this is my first permanent job as a staff scientist at Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. So I'm super excited about that. Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, for those who don't know it already, is a field station that's at about 10,000 feet up on the western slope of the Rockies. It's a really old scientific institution. It's been around since the 20s, more or less. And it's a home of a lot of long-term ecological research, including some of the longest standing data sets on mammal population dynamics, plant phenology, and in the last few years, it's been expanding a lot more into hydrology and geophysics. If you go up on a typical summer, you'll find about 200 researchers from institutions all over the world. And it really has a focus on field-based work. And so you might ask, like, okay, why is a guy with a remote sensing background now on staff at Rumble? And that's because there has been a real revolution in the availability of remote sensing measurements, and we think there's a huge opportunity to leverage some of these new observations, to match it up with the field stuff that's going on, to really foster new scientific discoveries. So that's the context for which I started work in January, and this webinar series is part of that push to essentially to make Rocky Mountain Biological Lab the best place in the country to do spatial ecology, landscape ecology research. And that's my personal goal. Okay, so I want to start with just kind of broad perspective on remote sensing. I essentially started my training in the early 2000s, which is kind of almost 20 years ago now, which is kind of crazy. But at that point, there were about 15 platforms in space, satellites, that were taking pictures of the Earth. By the time the 2010s rolled around and I started graduate school, that was in the 40s. And now there's more than 80 space-based platforms for environmental data. These are just the active and near-term planned missions for NASA. Ends up being about 30 different platforms and a bunch more sensors than that. This is just what the US government is putting in space. There are equivalent magnitude efforts from the European Union and emerging efforts from China and India. So it's essentially gone from a situation where you might have satellite data intermittently at coarse resolution for parts of the globe, through to a situation where the entire globe was imaged every day at a bunch of different wavelengths, but at coarse resolution, to now where essentially every object that's larger than a bathtub is imaged at visible and infrared wavelengths every single day. And that's essentially just the space-based platforms. And I honestly, like, I know what a lot of these missions are, but there are still a few that I'm finding out about every day. There's one that you'll see off to the right-hand side that's called Snoopy. This is a pilot project for a radar-based soil moisture measurement system. There's just a ton of new stuff out there, and it's actually kind of a challenge just to keep up with all the new sources of information coming in. And that's just in space. We've also got a bunch of airplane-based sources of information that can give us even finer scale data on the environment. These are sources like LiDAR, which laser scanning instruments that help us understand topography and forest structure. Imaging spectroscopy. These are instruments that can see at a bunch of different wavelengths, not just a few spectral bands, but instead sometimes hundreds. Enabling technologies to identify individual species of trees, for example, or minerals, map plant foliar chemistry across large domains. There's just a ton of applications here. And finally, there are new drone platforms, UAV platforms, that allow us to collect extremely fine scale data. In some cases, extremely fine scale. I'll show you an example in a second. So this is just an example of a Sentinel-2 image of Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. It's in an old silver mine ghost town called Gothic. So that's what the Gothic label in the middle of this slide is. And this is a pretty remarkable instrument. Sentinel-2 is one of the best Earth observing systems we've got. It images the entire globe at about 10-meter resolution, approximately every 10 days. There's a sister satellite, Sentinel-2A and Sentinel-2B, that overfly every 5 days. But this is still a pretty blurry picture compared to a lot of field data. You don't have many field collection procedures that are collecting data in 10 by 10 meter plots. They're usually smaller than that. But with drone platforms, we can actually get down to the millimeter scale. So this is a time series of millimeter scale drone imagery from a field site outside of Rocky Mountain Biological Lab collected about a year ago. And you can really see the growth and development of individual plants in this data. And that's what gets me really excited. I'm fundamentally an ecologist. And as soon as we can start seeing individual plants, individual animals, their effects on the landscape, that has me thinking that we can do a lot more to enhance field ecology research with remote sensing than we have been able to in the past. The other thing that I think it makes it a good time to build these skills is that automated processing makes lots of these observations analysis ready, or pretty close to analysis ready. And for a really long time, this was not so easy. So what a satellite sees is essentially brightness at a bunch of different wavelengths, either visible or infrared. And that's called radiance in the parlance of remote sensing. But radiance is actually just a property of the interaction of the light source, in this case the sun, with the ground surface and the atmosphere. So we want data about the surface, a property of the surface called reflectance, but instead we get sort of a filtered and obscured vision of what this reflectance is because of the influence of clouds, of dust, of all sorts of different things that affect those measurements. And what's really time-consuming in remote sensing, or at least was historically, is this process called atmospheric correction. And that's still an area of active research. I'm not saying that we've sort of nailed it, but a lot of these procedures have become automated. So we have a lot of analysis-ready surface reflectance data that's available for use across large domains from different satellites. And this, I think, takes the barriers down a lot for utilizing remote sensing in field research, because you don't have to really understand a ton about the physics of radiation propagation through the atmosphere to make use of this stuff. It's still helpful, but it's not necessarily as critical as it was 15 or 20 years ago. Okay, so finally, there's a bunch of new computational tools that make it possible to wrangle these big spatial data sets. As a field researcher, particularly for my master's program, I spent a summer collecting field data on red-cockaded woodpeckers. And at the end of the summer, I had a gigantic spreadsheet. I was so excited about my spreadsheet. It had something like 5,000 or 6,000 lines in it. I thought this was big data. But it turns out these data sets are huge. They're terabytes often. It's only possible to really use this data if we have new tools that allow us to wrangle that data. And these include core technologies like the GDAL, which is a software library that's used for a lot of spatial data manipulation. More recent development of technologies called COG, or Cloud Optimized GeoTIFF, which makes it possible to host data sets on cloud storage platforms and have them be manipulated very easily on somebody's desktop computer. The languages and software have gotten better. It's just a lot easier to learn and use a language like Python or R now than it was in the past. And finally, we have all these new cloud computing platforms, which means that we don't have to store all of these huge terabyte scale data sets on our own machines. We can instead keep them on the cloud and bring the computing to the data by using all these, stitching all these tools together. Okay. But it's not all gravy, right? There are some issues that that are still, unfortunately, pretty thorny, and I'll call them last mile problems. And there are really two that, that I'll highlight here. One is just that translating remote sensing measurements into environmentally relevant data isn't necessarily easy. So as a plant ecologist, I really care about plant physiology and plant cover and plant identity, right? But that's not, for the most part, what we directly observe using remote sensing. Instead, we observe reflectance. And that's just one or two steps away from the things that we really want to understand. And that means that there is a translation process that needs to happen where we take the things that we can measure and we correlate them with the things that we really want to measure, or say the things that we want to measure directly, that we can measure directly. And we want to use a procedure to infer those based on, based on reflectance. The second one is that it's still not entirely seamless to extract measurements where you need them. There's a ton of different data sources. They're scattered all over the internet. They're in different formats. They're in different projections. And it's not super easy to curate all the possible data that's out there, figure out what's relevant, and then summarize that data at your field sites or use them for extrapolation in ways that are useful. So it's just not, it's not seamless, at least not yet. And I'm not the only person thinking about these last mile problems. In fact, there are quite a few large-scale efforts to make remote sensing more accessible to a diverse community of researchers. And just two projects that I'll highlight here. The Australian government has sponsored something called the Open Data Cube, which is a software platform for synthesizing remote sensing measurements. There's another great project by a team out of the University of Idaho called Climate Engine, which is built off of Google's cloud platform. It makes it really easy to extract climate data and remote sensing data for field sites through a web interface. And I'll also highlight the work that I'm doing for Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. We're putting together this thing called a spatial data platform, which is essentially a curated, synthesized collection of high resolution, high fidelity spatial data sets that researchers can use. And I see my role as trying to cross that last mile, remove the barriers for taking advantage of these really powerful observations. I'm not going to talk really extensively about the spatial data platform today, but I will just talk about some of our design principles there. And the first one is reproducibility. So we're putting the full processing pipelines for the remote sensing products and source data publicly available on GitHub. We're making these products open access using a permissive Creative Commons license that allows redistribution with acknowledgement. Where we can, we're quantifying uncertainty. So we're trying to map how much we don't know in addition to the things that we do know. And I encourage you guys to check out more information about this spatial data platform and where we're going with the platform on Rumble's website. This is a link to, you'll be able to read some of the planning documents. Some of the materials that are associated with the webinar series are going to be up there. And we're adding new data all the time. So it's a good place to keep in mind. Okay, so that's essentially the first part of my talk. So the next thing is we're going to talk about sort of foundational concepts, but I want to open up, I guess, a opportunity for answering some people's questions before I move on. So it looks like. Yeah, it looks like we've got a question from Natalia Quinteros. Natalia, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Hi. Yeah, I was curious about these databases about the climate information, and I was wondering if they're global or they're just local for, let's say, the U.S.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it really depends on the database. The Climate Engine is global, but there are some data sets, for example, There's a data set called GridMet, another one called Prism, that are hosted on Climate Engine and accessible through it, but the data only covers North America. But there are other data sets, there's a bunch of satellite data products from a set of sensors called MODIS, and that data is global and accessible. So unfortunately, there are a ton of platforms and they have different scopes, but I'm going to talk a little bit more later in the talk about some of the major data sources that I found useful for both global scale, kind of continental scale, and for local scale work. But that's an excellent question. Thanks. All right, any other questions before we keep going? Alrighty, okay, so what foundational skills do we need to take advantage of this data? And, actually, so Ben Hogan has another question. You discussed data sets being in various formats. Are there movements towards standardization? That is also an excellent question. And the upshot is yes, but, okay, so there are a bunch of different trade-offs involved in data formats, including how small they are on disk, how quick they are to be processed, how efficient they are to stream across a network. So the format that I'm going to talk a little bit more about is called Cloud Optimized GeoTIFF. This is a rapidly emerging standard, and I think there will be some consolidation around this, but it has some limitations. For example, you can make a cloud optimized GeoTIFF with 30 layers, and it performs pretty well, but you can't make a GeoTIFF that's 3,000 layers and have it perform pretty well. So for example, if you wanted it to represent the output from a climate simulation, which has a representation of temperature across a domain for every day for 30 years, that's going to require a different format than another format that doesn't have that kind of depth. So there is a lot, I guess, a lot more standardization than there used to be, but there's also a proliferation of new formats. So my guess is that there's always going to be a subset of formats that are really heavily used, and then a bunch of others, sort of this long tail of specialized formats that that are necessary for particular use cases, or are more advantageous for particular use cases. But we're going to talk a little bit about the basic structure of a lot of these formats, and that is they're all formats for what's called raster data. There are essentially two different branches of spatial data: vector data and raster data. And raster data is special in that it's on a grid. And actually the word raster comes from a Latin word, rastrum, which is the Latin word for a rake. So you can sort of imagine a rake on a field of sand, putting in lines across horizontally and lines in vertically, making a grid, and that's the data format. So this is essentially just another way of saying it's image data. So in the middle here, you've got a satellite image and a zoom in on some of that, a small section of the middle of that image. And fundamentally, what we have here is a grid of numbers. And in this case, the numbers are representing essentially the brightness of Sorry, guys, I think my internet connection cut out really fast. We will go back to PowerPoint. All right, so we're dealing with raster data, and that's essentially a grid of numbers, and example raster data sets. These are just two from the spatial data platform work that I've been doing. One would be land cover. That's a categorical raster data set where the numbers represent codes of categories of things we find interesting or useful. In this case, different types of vegetation or land cover. They can also represent continuous values like canopy height across this entire domain. So on the right-hand map, The darker green areas of the map indicate taller canopies. That's another raster data set. So 4 key concepts that you really need to know to understand raster data and how it works. The first ones are extent and grain. And here you want to ask yourself the question, is the data I've got at an appropriate scale to be useful? And we'll talk a little bit more about what an appropriate scale is. Second is spatial autocorrelation. Autocorrelation is kind of a jargony term for smoothness. So how spatially smooth is the attribute that I'm trying to represent using raster data? And what's its smoothness at different scales? That's the spatial autocorrelation. We have to talk a little bit about sampling and resampling. So how do we extract useful data from a raster at field sites that may or may not be larger or smaller than the pixels themselves, the fundamental units of our raster data set? And we're going to have to touch a little bit on projections and coordinate systems. And that's because the world is 3-dimensional and most maps are 2-dimensional. So there's a bunch of different ways of translating that 3-dimensional world into a 2-dimensional map. And we have to pay a little bit of attention to some of the details there. But first, extent and spatial grain. So extent is pretty straightforward. It's just the geometry, the boundaries of your data set. And usually we think about this in the range of the X and the range of the Y coordinates. Spatial grain is also pretty straightforward. It is the size of the pixels. So each of those grid squares is a pixel representing a single number. And those pixels have a size, in this case, of about 1 meter. So that's fairly high resolution data from remote sensing standards. So the way that I actually think you guys should think about this is not necessarily to think of raster data sets as these kinds of little polygons, but rather think of them as point data represented at the centers of the pixels. So if you do that, you'll notice a couple of things. One is that the distance between points in the X and the Y direction is the same. But if you go diagonally from a pixel to say the Queen's move to the top right, that's actually a longer distance. So it's point data, but it has some particular quirks. Okay, so here's the grain and extent of some of the data sets that I'm generating as part of the spatial data platform. So on the left-hand side is a 3-meter grid, the middle is a 9-meter grid, and the right is a 27-meter grid. I've just overlaid those grid lines on an aerial photo so you can give a sense of how those data sets line up with objects in the world. So if I had 27-meter data, I would just have a single number to represent all the things that are in each of these pixels. And those could either represent the values at the center of the pixel, or they could represent some kind of spatial average across the entire pixel. So if we're looking at a satellite image that has 27-meter resolution, then it's essentially an average of the brightness or reflectance across that entire pixel. And that means that objects that are smaller than a pixel size aren't very well represented. So in this case, we're not going to be able to see buildings effectively in 27-meter data, but we will be able to see buildings effectively in 3-meter data. And in terms of extent, for the spatial data platform work, we're looking with 3 different nested extents that represent different data sources. So on the left-hand side, we've got really high resolution data for the Gothic town site. This is mostly based on drone imagery. And that domain is actually only a few kilometers to a side. In the middle here, we've got this Upper East River domain, which is about 30 by 30 kilometers. And all the way out to the right-hand side, we've got an Upper Gunnison River domain, which is much larger. So when we think about data products, you have to think about, is the resolution appropriate for my application? And is the grain, spatial grain appropriate? And then is the extent appropriate for my application? So how do you figure out what appropriate is? That seems like kind of an arbitrary or funny distinction, but it is to a certain extent. But there are some additional concepts that are going to be helpful for helping you choose an appropriate grain and extent. And that's spatial autocorrelation. So spatial autocorrelation just means correlation with oneself. And spatial autocorrelation just reflects the fact that that things that are closer together in space are more likely to be closer together in value than things that are farther away in space. That's kind of a jargony way of thinking about it. I just think about spatial autocorrelation as essentially smoothness. So if you think about an attribute of the environment, I've got two here. One is a hypothetical map of growing degree days. Another one's a hypothetical map of the day of last snow disappearance. Those two maps actually have different spatial patterns. So in this case, the green is high values and the orange is low values. And for growing degree days, we can actually see a lot of texture at fine scales. It's kind of rough at fine scales, but there's not that much texture at core scales. It's kind of smooth across the entire domain of the map. In contrast, the one down below here is essentially smooth at small spatial scales. So there's a lot of green pixels that are next to other green pixels. There's a lot of orange pixels next to a lot of other orange pixels. But there's a lot of roughness at larger scales. There seems to be a trend across the entire data set from the top left to the bottom right. And we need a way of describing this spatial pattern, this pattern of smoothness across different spatial scales. And what spatial statisticians have come up with is something called a variogram. So I'm going to show you guys two sets of variograms for these two different maps. And in this case, I want you to ignore the colored lines and just focus on the black lines here. So what we saw qualitatively before, this growing degree days map has a lot of variability over short distances and not as much variability across large different distances, is reflected in this plot of variance against distance. So if I were to throw down a bunch of points on these maps and then calculate the average variance between pairs of points at different distances from each other, then I would have the ingredients for constructing this variogram. And this is actually just a really important concept for understanding raster data. Things that raster data represents have a bunch of potential patterns of spatial autocorrelation, patterns of smoothness at different spatial scales. And then the quantities that they're trying to represent have a potentially different set of smoothnesses across spatial scales. So I want to sort of show you a concrete example. So I do a lot of work on vegetation plots. So these are essentially, you go out in the field, you throw down a 1 by 1 meter PVC quadrat, and you spend hours counting plants. That's great. Say you wanted to use a remote sensing measure that was related to, or that you thought was related to a question you were asking about these plots. For example, when did these plots green up in the spring? When was that happening? And we looked around, we were trying to find the best remote sensing measurements we could of when green up happened. And it turned out that those had a grid scale of about 500 meters. This isn't entirely hypothetical. Up until recently, the best observations that we had of phenology were at this 500 meter scale from a set of satellites called MODIS. So that's quite a scale difference here. And so the real question is this measurement made at 500 by 500 meter pixels relevant to my field plots that are 1 by 1 meter squares? And variograms can help you figure out whether that's right. So here are the vertical, here's that plot of variogram example from the previous slide, and there are two vertical red lines added to it. The left-hand vertical line is essentially the distance from one edge of my field plot to the other edge of my field plot. And so that's in this case about 1 meter. And then the line on the right is the grid scale, the spatial grain of this satellite-based data set. The black line shows how variance changes across the scale gap between my field data and the remote sensing data. Essentially, the remote sensing data can't capture any variance that's at a smaller grain than the spatial grain of the inherent spatial grain of the data. And what this indicates actually is that almost all of the useful variation in plant phenology is happening at grains that are finer scale in this example than the scale of the data. So this is a situation in which there's a clear scale mismatch. I'm not going to be able to get useful remote sensing measurements because there's just too much variability. The measurements taken at broad scales don't correspond well to the measurements that I'm interested in. And so we think about this as a rule of thumb. So is there less than a 25% difference in variance between the scale of field sampling and the raster data that I want to use? So if we imagine sliding this right-hand vertical red bar to the left, indicating having finer and finer scale measurements of plant phenology, we would eventually get to a scale that is such that the variance here is still larger than the field data, but it's not that much larger. It may be only 20% or 30% larger than the field data. That's the spatial scale at which we're going to start to get meaningful relationships between the field data and the remote sensing data. So what this indicates to me is that I really need to have phenology data at something like 50 meters or less to really represent what's going on at my field sites well. So that's, I think, a really useful application of those two concepts I talked about. Okay, we need to talk about sampling and resampling. So I mentioned before that one useful way to think about a raster data set is as a grid of points that are all located at the center of the pixels. So say I had a very small research site that was located somewhere in this domain. So in this case, the red dot here is the location of the research site. I have to ask myself, if I want to extract information from this raster data set, I have to choose which pixels are relevant. And so the simplest way to do this is called a nearest neighbor sampling. And so there I just ask, okay, what's the closest grid cell center? And I'm just going to extract that value at the grid cell center and assume that it applies to my particular sampling point. So that's very simple and very fast. But you can see that that point isn't actually super close to the center of the pixel. And so if it's near the edge, then there might be other, the true value might actually be a little bit different from that pixel center. And that's a situation in which we might want to use the values from adjacent pixels to interpolate a better estimate of what the raster value actually is at that location of the field site. And that's called bilinear interpolation. That's usually what we want to do for continuous values like elevation or like canopy height or slope. And that's probably the most responsible way to sample a raster. Of course, that doesn't work for discrete or categorical data. So if it doesn't make sense to sort of do a weighted average of the neighboring pixels, for example, on a land cover map where they're coded to numbers that represent particular types, not continuous measures, then nearest neighbor interpolation is going to be the best that we can do in most situations. Okay, so I talked about this in terms of sampling, but you can also think of, this is also a useful way to think about regridding or resampling one raster data set to match the pixels of another raster data set. So here I've just overlaid another grid on top of this, this grid before. And in this case, it has actually a little bit coarser resolution. The pixel centers are farther away from each other. And for each of those red points, it's exactly analogous to the problem I was talking about before. We can either use, figure out what the nearest pixel center to those red points is and take that value, or we can do some weighted average of all the pixels that are nearby. And that's the sort of bilinear interpolation bit. Awesome. Finally, last concept, we need to talk about projections and coordinate systems. Essentially, the world is not flat, but most maps are. And most geographic calculations actually do, they're just much more simple and intuitive if you think about 2 dimensions instead of 3 dimensions. That means that we need to figure out how to translate these really complex 3-dimensional objects, planets. The Earth is a kind of squashed spheroid or ellipsoid. We need to figure out how to take those 3-dimensional coordinates and translate them into a 2D, what's called a Cartesian coordinate system. And that's where projections come in. So these flattenable surfaces, which are in the middle here, represent different surfaces on which we're trying to project that 3-dimensional globe to get a flat map. And there are a couple of different ways to do that. And they have a bunch of different costs and benefits to them. This would be essentially a substantial part of an Intro to GIS class if you haven't taken it. But I'm going to try and boil it down to a few key points. The first is that you need to, in most cases, reproject data or resample data to a common projection and coordinate system if you want to work with raster data. You can, in some cases, get away with not doing this, but it's usually a bad idea. So you want to make sensible choices about reprojecting your data, get it all on the same coordinate system and projection. Just beware with this that some coordinate systems don't allow correct area and or distance calculations. For example, if we were to use latitude and longitude as our coordinate system, and we tried to calculate the area of a polygon or the distance between 2 points, you have to know that at least in temperate latitudes, 1 degree of latitude is not the same distance as 1 degree of longitude. And that actually changes as you go from the equator to the poles. It becomes more like the longitude lines get closer and closer together. By the time they reach the pole, those are, they're just right on top of each other. So it doesn't make sense to try and make area or distance calculations using a geographic coordinate system unless you're willing and able to do the extra math to make that translation correct. So just beware. And finally, for local scale work, there is a system of coordinate systems called Universal Transverse Mercator, which is usually a good choice for small scale stuff. It starts to get a little bit less useful when you're looking at regional or continental scale problems. And if you're looking at global scale problems, it just kind of is totally inappropriate. But for people with a lot of sort of field orientation who are interested in smaller scale problems, look to a UTM coordinate system first. Okay, so that's the foundational concept stuff. The next step is we're going to talk about how to get data. But before I do this, I just wanted to open up the meeting a little bit for questions. Let me bring up the chat really fast. All right. And so I think I actually lost the chat from the previous situation in which my internet connection cut out for a little bit. So I actually only have 3 questions here. And the first one's from Mark Raleigh, and I think that's more of a comment than a question. But Mark, if you're there, can you unmute yourself and make your comment? Oh, we may not have.
Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, there you go, Mark.
Yeah, hey all. It was just a quick comment. Just one thing to be aware of with MODIS, it was 500 meters is sort of your best case scenario. It's a scanning instrument, so one of the more extreme scenarios, if you're sort of at the edge of MODIS's scan, it can actually be about 10 times as big of a pixel. So it's something that for people who aren't aware of how MODIS is processed, you might just see the 500-meter grids, which are produced daily, but you need to be aware that the source data may actually be much more coarse. So anyway, it was just a comment.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate that. Ben, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Hi. Yeah, I think you more or less answered it immediately after I asked it. But yeah, I was just wondering whether you'd also use bilinear interpolation to go the opposite direction. So where you have greater resolution in your remote sensing data than you want to sample at. So you'd use bilinear interpolation to sample down.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And in most cases, actually, bilinear interpolation is not going to be what you want to use when you're downsampling. So if you're trying to summarize remote sensing pixels within a domain that's larger than those pixels, then you're actually thinking about aggregation rather than resampling. So in that case, you've got a couple of choices there. One simplest one would be to compute the mean of the pixels in the domain that you're interested in. You could also imagine any other statistical summary like a median or quantile or standard deviation. But in that case, yeah, you can use interpolation, but in a lot of cases, that's not actually what you want to do. Instead, you want to aggregate rather than interpolate. And this is actually related to Dan's question. Dan, do you want to unmute yourself and maybe I guess follow up on that?
Yeah, sure. So maybe I'm missing something here, but I was just wondering if bilinear interpolation is useful if each pixel's values, whatever they are, temperature, reflectance, are actually averages of information collected from within that little square or pixel. Because when you're thinking about these data as point data, it totally makes sense to do bilinear interpolation. But if those values are averages from a larger area, it seems like you're pulling from many things that are not necessarily close to your point of interest.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I admit I haven't really thought about that particular situation super closely. So I actually I don't have a definite answer to your question. It's something that I'm going to have to do a little bit of reading about. But it's an excellent point, and what Dan's really saying is that sometimes raster data sets are truly point referenced, so the centers of the pixels are the relevant areas. But in other situations, raster data sets represent averages of quantities within a pixel. And in that case, there might be some error involved in using bilinear interpolation to regrid data like that. I'm not actually sure if you could do better than bilinear interpolation, but there might be some extra loss of information in that situation. That's a great point. Thanks for sharing. All right. Any other questions about those foundational concepts before we move on? All right. Okay, so what data is out there? I'm going to really highlight three potential portals for discovering environmental data that might be useful to you guys. The first one is Earth Engine Data Catalog, and that's really a global scope catalog run by Google, and it has essentially every remote sensing data set that's been put online, publicly accessible in a regular format, along with a bunch of other data sets that researchers have contributed, and it's got a fairly slick interface. USGS Earth Explorer is an interface for a lot of NASA's Earth observing satellites, along with mostly North American focused climate data sets and a few other things. It's a very powerful platform. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the data catalog that we put together that highlights data sets that are much more applicable to the small scale of our work in Western Colorado. So I'm just going to grab my web browser really fast. And then share some of these catalogs. So Earth Engine Data Catalog is pretty slick. It has a search interface, It does not have super sophisticated tools for filtering data sets, at least not exposed in the web interface. Really, this is a companion to a much more powerful programming interface that Google's put together, which has a lot of filtering tools. But if I just wanted to search climate here, it's going to tell me, essentially, here are all the data sets that we've got that have tags of climate. And chances are there are a lot. It looks like, oh yeah, 10 pages worth of different climate data sets. There are interfaces for extracting data from Google Earth Engine. I use them a lot. More than anything, I use Earth Engine as essentially as a big data catalog because Google's data centers have much faster networking than some of the US government data centers for hosting things like Landsat and Sentinel data. But regardless, it's a great platform for discovery because it's updated pretty well, curated pretty well, and has some powerful tools. So USGS Earth Explorer is the second one here, and that is much more of a focused interface for identifying data sets that are available in a study area in North America. So you start essentially with a geographic filter. You have to decide what's your area of interest, and then it'll tell you all the data sets that are available right there. This is the primary portal for data sets that are developed and distributed by the US Geological Survey. So it has a ton of cool stuff in there. And then I'll also highlight a data catalog that we put together just this spring for all the data sets that are available at Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. So like I mentioned, the lab's been around since the 20s. We have GIS data sets, we have long-term data sets, we have a bunch of data sets that are released by different scientists working at the lab in a bunch of different platforms. And we just decided to put all this stuff in one spot. So here you've got a heterogeneous mix of data sets. This is a good juxtaposition. We have a high resolution land cover map right next to this long-term data set on glacier lily demography from a common garden experiment. It's also got a pretty simple search interface, but if we wanted to search for SDP, so for Spatial Data Platform, we've now come up with I think about 18 or so data sets that I've released so far this year. So check back pretty regularly. We're adding data sets all the time. We're not near done cataloging all of the public data sets for Rumble. That's going to be a longer term project. And then I'm going to be releasing a bunch of new spatial data products this fall and along with the spring. So just this is a good place to bookmark if you're interested in working at Rumble. Okay, so that's data set discovery, and I've really just given you three really brief examples of data discovery. I guess the strategies that I use are use those search engines. Also, just read papers. Oftentimes, new papers are going to come out. They're going to link to data sets, and they're easy sort of ways to find data. But I wish that there was sort of one search engine to rule them all, like a spatial data Google. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist yet. Google does have a dataset search utility that they launched, I think, late last year, but it doesn't have great tools for filtering geographic location. So we're still going to have to wait for the sort of holy grail of geodata discovery. But hopefully these three will give you some idea of how to move forward here. All right, so we're on to how do I build the skills necessary? There's a really short answer to this question, and that is practice. You start by solving a problem. You learn things you need to learn in order to solve that problem, and that sort of levels you up for solving other problems. What I'm going to be able to do today is just essentially demo a few things that are possible that work within my workflow. But I really encourage you guys to do a lot of self-study here. So find a problem that's relevant to your research, see if you can find a satellite-based or airplane-based or drone-based data set to apply to that existing data that you already have, and then just jump in and learn as you go. That's not necessarily efficient, but it's the only way that I've found to really build these skills. You sort of have to learn by doing. But I will give you guys a couple of demos here. I've got about a half an hour before my time is up. And so I'm really gonna talk a little bit about exploring and sampling some of the spatial data platform data sets that I've developed in desktop software called QGIS. And then I'm also going to talk about accessing some of these data sets using a programming interface, R. So if you guys want to follow along, this is the time in which you should bring up QGIS and R on your laptops. But before that, I'm actually going to talk a little bit about this new format, Cloud Optimized GeoTIFF, which I alluded to earlier. The challenge with a lot of these raster data sets is that they're really big. And that means that they take a lot of storage, they take a lot of computing power, and for the most part, you don't want all of that storage to be local. You want to, for the most part, keep data sets in the cloud, in storage facilities where they know how to deal with big data sets, move big data sets around, and importantly, back data sets up. So where if the big external hard drive that you bought for a project corks out, you won't have lost terabytes of important information. So Cloud Optimized GeoTIFF is a format that makes that really easy. GeoTIFF is an older raster format that has been around for about 20 years. And Cloud Optimized GeoTIFF just tweaks that format a little bit to add a new layer of what are called overviews and a tile index that allows you to put a COG file on the web, but still access it as if it was on a local file system. So for this demo, I'm going to actually bring up a bunch of these spatial data platform data sets. It's a total of about 25 gigabytes of data, but it appears nowhere on my hard drive, at least not right now. And instead, we're actually going to be accessing the data dynamically through the cloud. And I'm going to just bring up QGIS really quickly, and I need to change my screen sharing settings to make that possible. So hold on one second. All right, so in the GitHub repository that I shared, there actually is a pretty good, so there's a map, it's a subfolder called maps. In there is a file with the extension .qgz. So that is a data set, that's actually a project file that you can open up with QGIS. And it's going to take a couple of minutes to load, but once it does, you're going to see an interface that looks kind of like this. It won't necessarily be a blank map, but I've turned things off for now so it's not overwhelming. I just want to give you guys a little bit of an interface tour of QGIS. QGIS is the most commonly used open source geographic information systems desktop software. It's, I think, one of the slickest and most well-developed open source projects that I've ever interacted with. It's got a huge community of developers and users from all over the world. There's a ton of, I guess, new energy in developing QGIS and adding to functionality. And it's really getting to the point where you can go through your entire life without having to worry about the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is Esri's ArcGIS software. ArcGIS is still taught a lot and it's still used a lot. But I find QGIS to be more powerful out of the box, at least not without paying a bunch more for extra toolboxes, and pretty cool. But when you open up a map in QGIS, you've got essentially a pane here, which you're going to represent the things that you want to map, and then a couple of toolbars. So to the top right here, I've got the browser, and that has ways of accessing a bunch of different data sets, including the stuff that's on my own hard drive, as well as cloud storage facilities and access to overlays like Google Maps or Bing Maps. So here I've gone ahead and added a satellite image, or this is, sorry, the Google satellite composite of the upper Gunnison River Basin. And I've made it a little bit unsaturated, so it's easier to see data that's overlaid on it. And here in the table of contents, I have all of the different layers that I've developed as part of the spatial data platform. And I want to emphasize here, these are all living on a cloud storage bucket on Amazon S3. They're not on my computer, but I can treat them essentially just like they were. So if I were to turn on the topography here, I would have, this is essentially this is a hill shaded elevation map, 1 meter of the entire basin. It's about 2.3 gigabytes in size. But I can still just kind of scroll around just like it was a Google map or other online resource. It's a little bit less responsive if your internet connection, like mine, is not super fast. But it's still, you know, surprisingly usable. Another, I think, kind of amazing thing about QGIS is that it allows you to not just to view this this data, it actually allows you to interact with it, to process this using all the tools that are available in QGIS. So if I wanted to use this data to do some terrain analysis, say I wanted to calculate the slope of this data, I could use, let's see, this just slope tool, and I am going to add the correct layer and save it to a temporary file and run it. Now this is going to be pretty slow on my home internet connection because I just don't have a lot of bandwidth. So what it's doing is actually sort of segment by segment downloading the data from the server and calculating that slope map, as it were. When I was at work, this procedure on a fast fiber connection took essentially about 2 seconds. Not very much different from what it would be if I had downloaded the map locally. But your results may vary depending on the quality of your networking. If you ever wanted an excuse to invest in a gigabit fiber connection for where you are, this might be one. I'm going to go ahead and cancel that. I just wanted to let you know that that was possible. So essentially, any of the raster processing tools in QGIS, and there are hundreds of them, that include both the ones that are built into QGIS, including some other toolboxes from GRASS or Saga. These are other open source GIS tools. There's just a ton of functionality here for manipulating data. So how do I get a layer into this into the system that's hosted as a cloud optimized geotiff? So I'm going to open up a new map and won't save the others. Okay, so I'm going to go to layers and then to add layer and add raster layer. And essentially what I've done is just to take the URL for that data set and add a single string to it. So if I went to the spatial data catalog, or sorry, the Rumble data catalog, and I'm going to switch back to that so I can show you what that looks like. Share screen. There we go. So if I open up an entry in the catalog, it gives me a little bit of information about this data set. And I've got a couple of important links, including links to download the data set or view the metadata. So what I'm going to do here is just right click on this link, and I'm going to copy the link. And then I'm going to go back to QGIS. And I'm going to paste it right where it says raster datasets. No, paste. Oops. That was the text and not the link. So let me try that one more time. Copy link address, that's what I wanted. Then I'm going to go back to QGIS and paste that. I'm just going to add a single string in front of that, which is a /VSI curl. And that just uses a facility that's built into the technology that's underlying QGIS. And it tells it to use that, what's called a cloud file system. And I'm going to add that to the map and close. And now we've got the land cover map that's available. So now this is, like I said, this is not actually on our computer, but in a lot of respects, it acts like it does. So say we wanted to figure out what the land cover values were for field sites that we were interested in. So I'm going to actually go ahead and create a data set here, which is creating random points within the current extent. So I'm going to use the map canvas extent. And I'm going to just create 50 random points there. Tell them they have to be more than 10 meters apart. And then click run and close. And we've actually got random points in this domain. And I'm going to make them a little bit bigger so they're easier to see. Change their color. All right. So then what I can do now is actually use this thing called the point sampling tool to extract the values of the raster data set at those points. So that's actually a plugin. So if you go to the plugins here, I'm going to type in point sampling tool and have it install. Should be pretty fast. It's not a very large tool. And now in plugins, I have this point sampling tool available to me, the plugins menu. So I can go in there, and random points is where, that's the layer that contains sampling points. I'm just going to select the fields, including that land cover map, and then point it to a place on my computer, in this case applications, where I want the file to go, and it's going to be random points land cover. I can choose what the names of the fields are going to be. So in this case, I'll make that land cover and press OK. And it should do a little bit of crunching and then add that new data set to the map. So this data set looks like the old data set, but now it has the raster values already there. And technically what it's done is use nearest neighbor resampling to take the cell that's closest to each point and then append the value of that raster to the point data set. So I can go and look at the attribute table. This is like essentially a spreadsheet that's associated with this geographic data. And it has a new field, land cover, which has the land cover codes for all of those sites. So this is an example of a discrete data set, but this works for essentially any raster data set that you want, with the caveat that it always uses nearest neighbor resampling, which is not always ideal. Okay, so that's the pointy, clicky way of accessing these data sets. And that works really well for simple operations. And QGIS is a great platform for exploring and visualizing geographic data. But it's not great for statistical analysis or for science. So with the time that I've got left, I want to demo a workflow that I use using the programming environment R and a couple of packages that allow us to interact with these geographic data sets programmatically through the console. I'm using R here mostly because my target audience is very R heavy. You can just as easily accomplish any of this stuff in Python or a variety of other languages for that matter. But R is, for the most part, where it's at for biologists, at least currently. 10 years ago, it might be different. 10 years from now, it might be different. But I'm going to go ahead and switch over to RStudio, which is my editor of choice. But before I keep going with this, I just wanted to ask if there were any questions about the QGIS demo. I will say, if some of you guys have had trouble getting this set up, please stick around afterwards. I'm happy to help troubleshoot in the time we've got after the seminar. But any other sort of questions about the demo before we keep going? Alrighty. Okay, so first just a tour of RStudio. It's kind of a complex interface, but the two most important things for our demo today are the script window. So we have, in this case, oops. This is where we're going to be keeping track of the code that we're going to run. And then down at the bottom here is the console. So that's where R actually actively takes our commands. And so what I'm going to do is actually be moving information from the script down in the console. And I tend to do that using a keyboard combination, so you won't actually see me copying and pasting, but that's essentially what I'm doing here. So the comments here are hashed out, so it shows us a little bit about the script and who wrote it and what the timeline was for when it was last updated. There's also a line here called that installs packages. So R is sort of a bare bones system by default, and then there are hundreds and hundreds of packages that are contributed that extend the functionality of R. So if you wanted to install all the packages you would need to run this script, you would uncomment this line that starts install.packages, and then just run it. It would probably take a few minutes, but then give you all the functionality of all these libraries. So I've already done this for my machine, so I'm not going to recreate it, but just know that if you're trying to recreate it at home, the first thing you're going to need to do is install those packages. I'm just going to highlight these calls to library and run them through the interpreter. And that's just going to load all the functionality of those packages in there. The important ones that I want to highlight, the first one is called Raster. So that's the most common package for manipulating raster data in R. And it has a couple of really cool features and also a couple of limitations. It was, I think, first put together a little bit more than 10 years ago by a guy named Robert Hidgmans. There's also a library called SF, which is really good for reading and writing geographic data. We're going to do that to write out features that we can then go and explore in QGIS. And there's also a couple of libraries that I use for plotting. ggplot2 is really good for making plots. There's also an extension to ggplot called Spatial, which is good for making maps. And there's a couple of other packages that make it easier to do things like visualize raster data. I will say that it's great to to make plots and maps in R, it is slow and frustrating relative to doing it in desktop GIS system. So I have a couple of demos in here of plots that I've painstakingly made in R. But for a lot of my work, I'll create the data sets, I'll summarize the data sets, I'll do the statistical analysis. And for the geographic maps that include lots of raster data or lots of layers, I tend to make those in QGIS just because I would have to pull my hair out to recreate them in R. That being said, it's great to be able to recreate your plots programmatically, because that means that if a data set changes or something else changes, it's really easy to recreate things. But there's some friction there, which I'm hoping is going to decrease over time. Okay, so the first couple of lines here are just essentially setting up the workspace. And so we've loaded libraries. Now we're going to set the current working directory. That's essentially just like where the R interpreter looks for files. You should, if you're following along, change this to the path of whatever folder you downloaded the materials into. So if you've downloaded a folder from GitHub, it's probably in your downloads folder, but you're going to need to change that project to be an actual place on your computer as opposed to a place on my computer. And then I'll also say I did run into on a couple of test machines some issues with different versions of this package called GDAL. So I'm here checking the GDAL version. It should work for GDAL later than 2.2.3. In this case, we've got 2.4.2. But if you're using older versions of GDAL, you may have to reinstall it before this functionality works. The next thing I'm going to do is just download a programmatic version of the Rumble data catalog, and that's just stored as a CSV file on Rumble's website. You can read and write data seamlessly from, you can read data seamlessly from a website using this function read.csv. And then I'm going to use that view function to open up a spreadsheet style view of all the data sets that are available. So it doesn't give a ton of information about each data set, but it'll tell you what their titles are, what the resolution and domain is. The important things here are the data URL and the metadata URL. So each of those data sets has detailed metadata, including how the processing was done, a lot of things about the source and the license and a bunch of other stuff. And so the link to those that metadata is there. But what we're really interested in here is the data URL. So this is just the cloud storage location where that data set lives. So if you were to paste this URL into your web browser, it would just download the data set. But some of those data sets are pretty big, so we don't want to do that. And instead, what we want is to actually create a connection to that data set from R that doesn't involve downloading the whole data set at once. And that's what these little blocks of code do. So the first thing that we're doing here is extracting the URL information, or technically as a URI, from that catalog spreadsheet style data set. And so that's what this line of code does. It just filters that catalog to pull out all of the data sets for which this product equals digital elevation model. There's just one. They all have unique names. And then I'm appending that VSI curl magic string to the beginning of that URI. And then I'm just pointing this raster package using a function called raster at that path. So if I'm taking these two lines, if I just wanted to look at what DEM path looks like, it's just a string that looks exactly the same as the string that we pasted into the add raster data set field in QGIS. Except now we're going to do it programmatically using R. And so that creates an R raster object called DEM. And it looks like it took a few seconds. What it's actually doing is reaching out to the server and downloading the header file from that data set. And that has all the information we need about how the data is organized on the disk on Amazon's system. And then if we just add that to the console, it gives us some basic metadata about the file. It tells us it's a raster layer. It tells us the dimensions. It turns out this is a 25,000 by 22,000 cell raster. And that means that it is, let's see, 584 million pixels. So that's a pretty big data set, 1.1, one by 1 meter resolution. And it also tells us information about the extent and the coordinate system and the source data. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the same thing for 2 more rasters. These are including the digital elevation model. This is a flow accumulation map and a surface water map. So it'll take a few seconds to load those in. But importantly here, it's not downloading the whole data set. It's just downloading the header information, and then it's creating an object on disk that we can use to manipulate the data that's in the cloud. And so this is what we're doing here. So the first thing I'm doing is actually creating what's called a raster stack. I just want to make a single programming object that includes all 3 of those layers of the different data sets that I made. So that's called a raster stack, and we create it using a function called stack. And now I've renamed those different layers so they have short names that are easy to remember. And I've also created a little sub-study area. So I'm not actually interested in this whole domain. That's a much larger study area than all my sites are. So I'm gonna zoom in on a place that, I guess a domain that's much closer to the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. And that's what Gothic extent is. It's an extent object, and that just means it's a matrix that has the minimum and maximum coordinates for the boundaries of the study area we're interested in. So I create that extent object. I can then use it to subset those rasters to my area of interest. This is using a function called crop. So this works just like in an image editor. It's going to take a big raster and just extract a subset of that. But the important thing here is that this is actually going to make a local copy of a subset of this large set of rasters that's stored in the cloud. So in this case, what it's actually going to do is just download the little section of those files that are around the sites that I actually care about. And that's going to create a small subset area that, a small set of rasters that are actually on disk. And that is going to take a little bit of time because it actually has to download the data for all those sub areas. Not too long, but this is going to be much faster if you're on a fast internet connection and much slower if you're on a crappy Wi-Fi connection like I am. All right, so we've made local copies, and then we can actually manipulate this data just the same way that we could any other local information. So in this case, I'm interested in creating a slope and aspect layer to complement the digital elevation model. And we're using a function built into the raster package called terrain that allows us to calculate those slopes and aspects. And that was pretty fast because those files are already local. They're the subset we downloaded. And I can also do kind of arbitrary arithmetic with these raster maps. And in this case, I'm calculating a log transform version of this flow accumulation map and creating a new map called flow_log. And then I can check and see whether that is in memory. So for really small rasters, those are going to be processed in memory by the raster package. And if they're large enough, then they're actually going to be written to temporary files on disk. And that's a little bit slower. So ideally, what you want is to find a study area that's small enough to where everything can fit in memory. That makes everything super fast. But if that's not the case, then raster handles all the reading and writing to disk. So it just sort of like, it's the same as the interface that we see, but there's a little bit different stuff going on behind the scenes. Okay, so we've got this subset data. Let's just plot it. And the default plots for the raster package are they're not great, but they're serviceable. and they'll have at least a way of visualizing some of these data sets. So in this case, green colors are high values and orange colors are low values. And we can see, yeah, we've got some data there. That's great. But these aren't wonderful maps. So we might want to do some things like calculate a hillshade layer for plotting. Sorry, but before I do that, I just want to sample this stack of rasters at a bunch of points. And so I'm going to create random points using a function called sample random. And that's just going to take a random sample of cells and give it back to me as a data frame, as a spreadsheet style data set. And I'm going to name that Gothic samples. And it'll take a little bit of time. But now I've got actually a spreadsheet style data that has all the values for all those rasters, and I can verify that by investigating some stuff about this object. It's what's called a spatial points data frame. And it's got a slot in here called data. And so I'm just looking inside that Gothic samples object and grabbing the data from it and then printing it to the console. So now, yeah, so I've got those values are all of the values at those different sampling points that I made. And I can make just a really simple map of those points using this code. And so you can think of this is essentially as like a really ugly version of the map that we made before that has a different set of random sampling points in QGIS. But here we've done it using R. Okay, so that's just like how to just get data in, sample it. I want to talk a little bit about this issue of sampling and resampling and spatial autocorrelation a little bit more. And to do that, I'm actually going to resample this data to coarser resolution. So all these maps are 1 meter, which is pretty fine. And we're going to create new versions of these maps that are, instead of 1 meter resolution, 100 meter resolution. And that's going to allow us to compare measurements taken at 1 meter to measurements taken at 100 meters. And this is actually kind of cool. And it'll take a few seconds to make those coarse resolution versions. And I just wanted to plot the original data really fast so you can see what that looks like. So that's what the original resolution data looks like. You got, I think now 7 layers. And then let's take a look at what it looks like once we've resampled the data. Okay, so they've got some similar geographic patterns, but much more pixelated, of course, because now we've resampled down to 100 meters. What we can then do is extract the values of that coarsened data at the same points we used before to sample the fine resolution data. And there I'm going to use a function called extract. And so we're going to take the coarse resolution stack of rasters, and we're going to sample it using the Gothic sample points that I've made before. The method we're using is bilinear. Remember that resampling concept I talked about before. That's going to give us the values at those locations, both for the 1 meter data and the 100 meter data. And I'm going to add some eastings and northings to it. That's just adding the sort of the coordinates back into the spreadsheet style data. And then I'm going to write this back to disk. And using that stwrite function, I'm just going to save this Gothic samples to another file that's a geo package. And then I can open that file back up in QGIS if I want. But let's go back to this scale issue. Let's plot the original 1 meter resolution data versus the resampled data. So I'm going to create 3 little plots using ggplot here, and then arrange them into a single plot using this grid.arrange function. And I think it's actually like, it's worthwhile, oops. it's worthwhile exploring this a little bit. So let me share my screen. And we can see the whole thing. Share. Okay. All right. So for 3 of those maps, what I've done is just compare the 1 meter resolution data to the 100 meter resolution data. And we've done that for elevation, we've done that for slope, and we've done that for log of flow accumulation. And I think this is actually really fascinating. So if I were to take the measurements from a 1 meter resolution digital elevation map and a 100 meter resolution digital elevation map, they are really, really close to each other. Their correlation coefficient is more than 99%. And so you might think, okay, that's cool. It means that it doesn't matter whether my elevation map is super fine scale or super coarse scale. I'm going to get about the same extracted measurements from that, and that's true. The same is not true actually for some of the things that we're deriving from the elevation map. So this is the center panel is that same comparison for slope instead of elevation. It's just like the elevation change across a 3x3 cell kernel. What that shows us is actually much much poorer correlation between the fine scale data and the coarse scale data, and things look even worse for flow accumulation. There's essentially no relationship between the 1 meter resolution flow accumulation and 100 meter resolution flow accumulation. So what's going on here? And it has to do with spatial autocorrelation. So the elevation map is pretty smooth across the distances that we're dealing with here, and in this case, 1 meter to 100 meters. That's not actually true for slope. Slope varies a lot over very short distances in response to microtopography. And the same thing is true of flow accumulation. So we can actually think about this in terms of the variogram such that we're going to see variance increase with distance very slowly on a relative basis for the elevation map, but much more quickly at short distances for the slope and log flow accumulation map. And this tells us something about why it's so important to have high resolution data for the things that vary a lot across short distances. So it might be fine if our quantity of interest is smooth across small spatial scales, then to have coarse scale representation of that data and still have the same fidelity. But if stuff varies a lot at fine scales, then we need to make sure that there's a really close match between the scale of the raster data we've got and the scale of the field data we've got. Okay, so that's sort of bring things around to some of the conceptual stuff we were talking about before. So that is very close to the end of my talk. But I will say I've got at the end of this script a couple of examples of creating nice maps in R. And I'll caveat that by saying that they're pretty slow. So one of the steps here is actually converting some of the raster data to a polygon so it displays better. And that actually takes a few minutes to do. Even on my sort of piddly MacBook Air laptop. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you guys to download this script yourself, take a shot at running it, take a shot at making pretty maps in R, and that's sort of scratching the surface of what you can do. I've also included a script for parallel processing large data sets in tiles using R, and that's this other script, process cloud data parallel.r. And because we're almost out of time, I'm going to actually not I'm not going to talk about this a lot, but if you have the time, it's worth your while to download it and play around with it, see if you can get it to go. Okay, some concluding thoughts are coming up, but I do want to give people a chance to ask questions one more time before I sort of sum things up. I appreciate you guys sticking around for an hour and 40 minutes. Yeah, I just wanted to check in and see if there are any questions that you guys had about the demos that I did before we depart. Okay, so Corey, that's a great question. Do you want to ask it on the audio?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious if there are workflows. I mean, what you showed was the Rumble spatial data products, and I'm wondering if some of the other things like Google Earth Engine allow for accessing and processing data from the cloud, like you're doing in this example.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is yes. The USGS Earth Explorer is planning to transition their system to COGS within the next 2 years. It's a really elaborate system, so I'm not sure how straightforward that's going to be, or whether it's going to go forward as quickly as they hope. But that's going to allow workflows like this with the full repository of USGS Earth Explorer data. That's going to be super powerful. For Earth Engine, they actually have very similar workflows that are already possible using Google Earth Engine. They're not using COG on the back end. I'm actually not sure what their internal representation of the data sets are. It's probably something weird and googly. But it enables a very similar workflow. So you can use, there's an R package called RGEE. There's a Python package called GEE that allows you to essentially reproduce these workflows using data sets that are stored on Google Earth Engine. And I decided not to host the SDP data sets on Earth Engine just because because there's a little bit more friction in terms of learning that interface. It's a pretty complex system, and if you really want to unlock the full power, you sort of need to learn JavaScript. But the short answer is a bunch more platforms are going to be using COG, and there are a lot of the existing platforms that allow these kinds of mixed cloud and local workflows. So thanks.
Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so some concluding thoughts. Thank you so much for sticking around for this. It's been fun to put together, and I hope it's useful for you guys. I will say I'm going to stick around for a few minutes if you guys want to chat about. I know that it's never seamless to just pick up somebody else's code and run it. So if you want a little bit of help troubleshooting, stick around. And I can hopefully help with some of those things. The other thing that I'll say is that the next webinar we've got coming up is in October, and it's going to be about study design. So we're really focusing on how can we use the foundational skills and the tools that I've demoed here to really start to plan some science. And then the later part of the winter and spring, we're going to highlight some new efforts that we've got to use imaging spectroscopy data, LiDAR data, data from drone photogrammetry to develop some of these new data products. So I'll be sort of leading you guys down the roads that I've been going down over the past year, and some of the things that I've learned in terms of how to do this work. That's sort of where we're going. But I was just really excited to see how much interest we've got in the webinars, and I hope that you guys can join me next time. Yeah, with that, I think I'm gonna say sign off if you're looking for an excuse to sign off, and if you want to ask me some questions about the in practice stuff, please stick around and also I'm also happy to respond by email if you have a question that crops up. It's ikb@rumble.org. So thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then the other sort of stuff that happens after that, it's going to be not recorded. Okay, thanks guys.